Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the LATAM Stocks Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flood. Today I'm speaking with Fabio Jamra. Fabio is a partner at RGS Partners, one of the leading middle market mergers and acquisition firms in Brazil. Specifically, he's responsible for tech and software. So obviously, we're going to talk about tech and software M&A as well as the M&A market in Brazil in general. So we got a lot to talk about, and I want to get right into it. So, hi, Fabio. How are you?
Hey Patrick, fine and you?
Good, thanks. I appreciate you coming on to talk to me.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So before we get into the M&A stuff and RGS, tell me a little more about you. Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? What career path led you to become a partner in mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, sure. I'm originally from São Paulo, but I grew up in the countryside, as a lot of Brazilian São Paulo families do, their children outside of the capital. After a while, when I graduated at school, I went to São Paulo to FGV to do business school there. It's a good university we have here in São Paulo. After that, I worked briefly at Deutsche Bank in the investment banking division, and then I joined RGS in 2015, which was a very small firm at the time. We had about 4 to 5 people.
And how did you end up specializing in software and tech? Was that always an interest of yours? Was it that the market was growing, so you grew alongside the market?
It was kind of natural as we grew within RGS. We grew from about 5 people to 50 people now. We did have a lot of exposure to tech deals. I had the pleasure of working in three specific deals that were kind of a game changer for me. Two software companies and one fintech company. So let's say high profile deals or more complex and larger deals than what I was used to do with sophisticated founders that I was very excited to advise. And then I started feeling comfortable with software companies and tech companies, and also the dynamics of those deals. It's a little bit more, let's say, rushed. You have to be more available to your client. They are always very not only sophisticated, but eager to do the best deal possible because they worked very hard founding that company and growing to the exit stage. So I kind of started liking those deals, and for 2 years now, I've been doing mostly software deals and a little bit of tech as well outside of software, but mainly software.
Awesome. That's a great story. So let's talk a little more about RGS Partners in general. You mentioned when you got there were 5 people. Now there's 50, which makes you one of the bigger middle market M&A firms in Brazil. So can you give listeners just an overview of what you guys do at RGS Partners?
Yeah, sure. We are a middle market M&A boutique, so we do deals ranging from $10, $20 million up to $200 million. That's what we call middle market. Below that, it's usually hard to find a format that would work for us financially. And also, sometimes it's very specific buyers that would acquire those small companies. And larger than that is a market that is very competitive within the big investment banks. So we found a way to operate this space. We do mostly sell side mandates, a little bit of buy side. We also do have DCM advisory for 2 years now, in which we will structure debt capital markets products, but mostly we are focused on M&A.
Now, what are some of the other industries that RGS specializes in? I know you do tech and software, but are there any other industries where there's partners specialized like you?
Yes, we do have a lot of sector specialization. We believe that's how we can deliver the most value to our clients. We have three partners covering tech. We do have a nice healthcare coverage, agro and consumer as well. Education, we do a few transactions as well, energy. So we do have mostly all the coverage related to sectors in which there is high activity of M&A here.
Okay. So you mentioned it's mostly sell side mandates. So it's an international audience then. So let me ask you about cross-border M&A. Who are the buyers for your sell side mandates? Is it typically Brazilian firms? Is it common for international companies to acquire Brazilian companies?
It's a mix. Of course, there are transactions in which the buyer is Brazilian. It's perhaps a consolidation strategy. The buyer acquires a lot of companies. Then we try to position ourselves as advisors in those sectors. But there's also a lot of activity in cross-border M&A right now. It has been growing, so more and more foreign companies are looking at Brazil as some geography with growth, and we are seeing more and more foreign buyers. The type of buyer varies a lot. I'd say we have smaller numbers of private equity transactions here. They are more selective, and there's a fewer number of private equity firms in Brazil. So the buyers are most strategic from Brazil and abroad as well.
Do you think the international companies do a good job of M&A in Brazil? Like, is it an effective strategy from what you've seen as a way to implement your business in Brazil or grow an existing business?
Yes, some of them have done a great job and established a large and healthy operation here. We see a lot of examples of companies that have Brazil as one of their priorities within their M&A strategy. Of course, there's a bias in that because we speak to companies who are looking at Brazil. There are a few unsuccessful cases. So companies that get into Brazil 5, 6, 10 years after that, they do not learn how to operate here and they just sell or they close their operations. It's a mix of not having the right persons to running the operation, not being able to get acquainted with the tax complexities. It's a large country with reasonably complex logistics and also tax regime. So not all of the companies do a good job, but there are a lot of examples of companies that were very successful.
Great. So what about the domestic M&A market then in Brazil? Is it a robust market, Brazilian companies acquiring other Brazilian companies as well?
Yes, it is deepening. When we start, the market was very small. So 10 years ago, not a lot of M&As, not a lot of M&As with advisors as well.
Mm.
At some point in time, we used to close, let's say, 4 to 6 deals a year, and we were already one of the largest M&A advisory firms in Brazil. But after, let's say, 2019 or 2020, there was a big deepening in the market, a lot of IPOs, cheaper debt, our interest rates reduced at that point in time. So a lot of new consolidators and new companies willing to do M&A and to take risks. There was also, let's say, a big governance upgrade or in the quality of the company. So we used to have a lot of mortality in due diligences, that the companies did not
Mm.
pay their taxes in the right manner, or they had some kind of trouble that would arise during the due diligence. And this has reduced a lot. We see a lot of better companies, more organized, due diligence, mortality going down, more buyers with capital to do M&A and with more track record as well. So we are in general, very excited about the future of M&A. It's still very small compared to the US and more mature markets. And we think there's a lot of growth in the future.
So what about cross-border going the other way? What about Brazilian companies making acquisitions abroad? I know Suzano recently made headlines that they plan to make an acquisition abroad for, I think, 15 billion reais, which is about $3 billion. And I read that that was the largest outbound acquisition possibly since like 2007. So how common is it for Brazilian companies to acquire internationally?
Yeah, it's still timid. So few companies with the structure to do that. Of course, on the commodity side, there are some big players like Suzano, as you mentioned, JPS in the protein side, who has been acquiring a lot abroad. There are a few tech companies starting to look at acquisitions, especially in the Americas, I would say LATAM and the US, much less in Europe and other parts of the world. Yes, it's getting more usual. It's not a big thing yet because the companies are not that big and Brazil is a big country. So sometimes there's a lot to do inside Brazil before you think
Mm.
about going outside. But yes, there are a few cases.
Okay. So you guys put out a great M&A report about the Brazilian M&A market, and you showed absolute deals in M&A, annually, and you mentioned the change in the market in 2019, right? Like the governance improved, M&A started to pick up, but it looks like it peaked in about 2021, both for M&A transactions and IPOs on the Brazilian stock exchange. So can you maybe explain the trend then? What happened in 2021 that the market got so active, and then why is it downtrended since?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very much related to, let's say, the COVID boom in the capital markets. So a lot of IPOs. So we had the lowest interest rate since forever here in Brazil, very low interest rates compared to what we are used to. So companies went shopping, a lot of capital, cheap debt, good opportunities for acquisitions. The tech market was very, very hot. So it was a very good moment for M&A. And since then, our interest rates just went up and up. Capital markets closed. So no more IPOs, no more follow-ons. We do have the windows here, they open and close very fast. So last year was a downturn in terms of number and volume of transactions. Right now, I feel like it's picking up a pace. We are having small, but let's say constant reductions in our interest rates again, getting to a healthier level. Some external capital coming as well. So yeah, it should be a better year, 24, and I have high hopes for 25.
Okay. Now, do you think a lot of the capital that got invested in 2021, was that well invested, or was there a boom and a lot of capital got misallocated? I mean, were there bad acquisitions in 2021, bad IPOs?
Yeah, of course, there is good and bad. A lot of the companies that IPO'd in that period, they have their shares depreciated a lot recently. I don't know if there's fundament to that, but it's certainly bad for investors. It might regain some of the value that it was lost. But yeah, there are some bad examples for the investors. There are some good ones as well. In terms of private capital, so M&A, it's harder to tell because you don't know the bad stories. Of course, there were a lot of companies being sold at high valuations, but it's hard to tell that if that was a good or a bad move for the acquirer. Sometimes it's part of storytelling in an IPO, a larger story, so it's hard to tell.
Interesting. So you mentioned in the report too that the majority of acquisitions are made by strategic buyers. I think if I remember correctly, it's over 60%. And you already mentioned that, financial buyers like private equity funds, they're in Brazil, but they're not as active as elsewhere. So do you think that's going to increase in the future? Do you think, more and more private equity firms are going to start focusing on Brazil? Is that a growth market as well?
Yes, I'd say yes. In terms of structurally, Brazil is a great country looking forward. It's a large country, a big population, decent income per capita, decent governance. So I think private equity should start looking at Brazil more carefully. Of course, there are some very interesting funds already here, but the capital allocation is low. It's hard to find a good deal. It's hard to allocate capital, and there's still not a lot of available capital. So the funds, they are very selective. They wait for a very, very good opportunity to allocate capital. There is VC money, so I'd say it's easier to find good venture investment here than to find a growth investment or a secondary when you get to a more mature stage with your company. But there is some VC capital.
Are there any industries in Brazil that are favored by the private equity funds or that are particularly attractive?
Yeah, they look for recurring revenues, for predictability, as we do have some downturns here, some volatility in our macro cycles. They look usually for predictability. I'd say there is a lot of capital going towards tech. There's a lot of capital going towards energy. So we are very well advanced in our energy transition process, and a lot of funds, they invested in this thesis. It's harder to invest in retail, in consumer, because it's more cyclical. Agro attracted a lot of capital as well, but it's also cyclical. Right now has not been, this year specifically, has not been a great year for agro. That's about it.
Yeah. So you gave me a perfect segue to my next question. So since 2012, energy and utilities were the most active industry for M&A in Brazil in terms of the number of transactions. But tech has been the fastest growing recently for M&A. And I think for most investors, those are like the opposite ends of the risk spectrum, right? Like energy and utility companies are typically thought of low risk, low return, and then tech is considered high risk, high return. So can you just explain that phenomenon a little bit? Why has energy and utilities been so active? And then why tech? Why the two polar opposites of the risk spectrum?
Yeah, that's a good question. I see both markets as structurally needed. So there's a big energy transition process and there's a big digitalization process. On the energy and utilities, I would focus on energy because that's where most of the transactions were concentrated. This is a mix of investment for new projects and also big mergers and big acquisitions of well-established players. And as the transactions are very large, it's representative within the overall M&A picture. With regards to tech, it's another scenario, as you mentioned, but it's also structural. A lot of digitalization, companies investing more in software. We have also a big financial framework changing. So our central bank introduced the PIX, which is a new payment method, and that drove a lot of M&A activity. So it's a fastly changing environment with company investing more and more in technology, a lot of VC capital funding those companies. I think that those are the main reasons.
So you think both industries will still be active in M&A? They'll still be two of the leading industries in Brazil over the next 2 or 3 years for M&A.
Yes, that would be my guess. I don't see cyclicality or volatility in that in the short term energy transition process here, although we are quite advanced compared to other places of the world. It is still will take some time and a lot of capital to be finalized or in a steady state. And tech as well. There's a lot of space, a lot of good companies. I'm every day talking to a different and more interesting company. We'll either look at a funding or an exit soon. So yes, I think it will be in this way the next 3 years at least.
Okay. So you mentioned the changes in the regulatory environment related to fintech and PICs, and a lot of venture capitalists I've spoken to have highlighted the same thing. And you mentioned fintech specifically, and I know that like 47%, 50% of all the venture capital dollars go into fintech in Brazil. So I'm curious, what does fintech look like for you from a middle market M&A perspective? Like how common are fintech companies? Is it the same overrepresentation within tech or not?
It's a good representation. I don't know if it is the same way as VC capital because although fintechs are fastly growing and demanding a lot of capital, I think the exits right now are more towards software. So there
Mm.
are perhaps more consolidators and more buyers looking for software right now than fintech. But of course, there are great exits at fintech as well. So perhaps in our portfolio, it's a little bit more software than fintech, but fintech is very representative as well.
Okay, interesting. So then maybe what's a typical software deal look like for a middle market M&A? I mean, can you just walk me through? It's a strategic buyer, domestic, international. What's the M&A market in general for tech and software?
Great. Yes, it's a mix again, some Brazilian buyers. So we do have a few well-established software players here. The consolidators are looking at Brazil very carefully. Constellation Software, this type of buyers. There is some capital raising as well, although it's harder to find a private equity acquiring control of a software company here in Brazil, but there are some minority investments and some strategic buyers as well that will look at cross-sell or synergies. They are not a software consolidator, but they are from another space within technology, and they do want that software piece to complement their portfolio. So it's a mix of buyers, but a lot of very active buyers.
Okay. Good. So I think luckily we're going to have time, and I'm going to ask you then about a recent deal that you worked on with Quiver. So can you tell listeners what was Quiver, acquired them, why? Can you just tell us a little about the deal?
Yeah, sure. Quiver is a leading broker, insurance broker software firm. So they've been on the market for a long time, 20 something or 30 years. They were leading this market, mostly focused on the large insurance brokers. And then on the other side, there is Dimensa, which was the acquirer. Dimensa is a JV from TOTUS, which is the largest software company in Brazil, a listed company as well. And this JV is between TOTUS and B3, which is our stock exchange, also a listed company, very large one. And they made this JV to build a company focused on financial market software. It's basically a consolidation platform acquiring software, financial market software firms, and then they will explore the synergies, cross-sell, whatever, to make this company large and perhaps, I don't know the future plans, but maybe an IPO. They've done 4 or 5 or 6 acquisitions so far, and then we were advising Quiver, which was a way for them to get into insurance. So they wanted to start an insurance software business unit, and they found the Quiver opportunity very interesting.
So help me understand a little more about Quiver's actual software. Like, what does it do for an insurance broker? Is it pricing software? Is it?
Yeah, it's a mission critical software. So it basically runs all the major activities of an insurance brokerage firm. It's a CRM, it's a pricing software, it's a API communication between the insurers and the broker. So basically everything. Also for some kind of brokers, the back office as well, billing, commissions, splitting the commissions. So everything within an insurance broker did also have an interesting BI consolidating insurance data. And that was what attracted Dimensa. They see this as a kickstart in their insurance software business unit. And the founders also were very good and very talented.
And they do all types of insurance, health insurance, medical insurance, life insurance. It's
all except health.
okay.
So it's what we call mainly what we call P&C, property and casualty.
Interesting. And yeah, so I mean that's interesting. Is there anything else worth mentioning about the acquisition, you think?
No, it was a good deal for our client, a good deal for the buyer. We were able to meet the interest of our client to have an exit and to diversify the risk, and also be part of something with a future upside, something bigger that will have more entry in the insurers. We'll be able to develop new types of software. So I think it was an interesting transaction.
Yeah, you remind me of one more question I wanted to ask you, and this isn't about Quiver specifically, but you mentioned the quality of the team. And I'm curious, how common is it for a full exit in middle market M&A in Brazil versus, say, an earnout where the founding team and management stays on for a year or two?
Yeah, most of the transactions, they will include some kind of alignment of interest in the future. It's not that usual to see 100% acquisition without any earnout or future payment component. So usually the transaction will be structured in at least two steps, one upfront payment, one future payment related to or retention of clients or increase of revenues or another metric. But yeah, it's not that common to find 100% deals paid at closing.
Okay, interesting. So that's all I've got on my question list. Is there anything about RGS, Brazilian M&A market, tech and software market you think might be interesting for the listeners before we finish up?
Yeah, not really. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any ideas or topics to discuss. I think M&A here has a lot of growth going forward and a lot of interesting companies looking for investors. So any kind of ideas, please let me know.
And your LinkedIn page is the best place to send listeners, and RGS's website as well?
Yes, I do have a LinkedIn page. I think you'll post that there, Patrick. Please feel free to reach out. We do have a website as well that is very easy to find.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Fabio. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate you doing it.
Thank you, Patrick.